This makes me think of Milos's captive mind. Once you are faced with basic lack of safety in your daily life, everything else becomes a luxury.
Is the Calling versus Skokie case an example of a crossroad moment where freedom of speech must be protected, even for the worst of its citizens? Is this something that can be easily overcome and threatened if individuals start turning an eye from it? So, what are the differences between free societies and unfree societies?
Well, thank you very much indeed, Gabriel. I find myself enjoying all the benefits of freedom today, of being able to speak to you and to say whatever I like to you. Tonight, I want to focus on the experience of unfreedom and to try to explain with that younger generation in mind what exactly unfreedom is like and how, by recognizing it, we can protect the institutions of a free society. I'm hoping that you can see two tables, one famous for its size, the other is of a small desk. But let's try to understand not the personalities, but the fundamental structural differences between unfree and free societies. Because in many ways, the war that is being fought in Ukraine today, the reason that I believe Ukrainians are fighting so tenaciously against the Russian invaders is precisely that they have come to understand, since the breakup of the Soviet Union, what a free society is. The first of my 5 witnesses is an extraordinary Russian, Yevgeny Zamyatin. When he wrote a book, We, which I can't recommend to you enough. We was the first book banned by the Soviet censors. When it was published abroad, it led him into such political trouble that he eventually emigrated. We is an extraordinary book. It inspired, amongst other books, the more famous 1984 by George Orwell. It's set in a future one state whose ruler is known as the benefactor. The one state's a surveillance state, and it's a more ruthlessly efficient surveillance state than Orwell's in 1984, and certainly a more prescient one than Aldous Huxley's earlier Brave New World. My next witness is a very different kind of person. Victor Klemperer was born in 1881, and he describes in his extraordinary diary what it is to have your rights sliced away. We think we understand the Holocaust because we've read Primo Levi, but we don't really understand the process that led the German Jews from near total assimilation by the end of the 1920s. Klemperer's diary is the way into this problem, because each salami slice of his civil and political rights is described in this extraordinary journal. As one reads one's way through this remarkable document, one realizes that this was a process that was bureaucratic, sadistic psychologically, but very different from a rush to annihilation. As a philologist, Klemperer was extraordinarily astute in observing the way that language was used in order to spread the ideas of the Nazis imperceptibly. My third witness was a remarkable scholar, Czesław Miłosz, a Polish author and poet, best known for his book, The Captive Mind. But I want to simply sketch the argument that Miłosz makes. Miłosz argues that Americans have no idea what it is to be in a society that has collapsed in time of war. His description of the collapse of Warsaw, and it's clearly intended to be Warsaw, into fear, panic, and terror. In the concluding part of this passage, he makes an extremely astute observation. The man of the East, he writes, cannot take Americans seriously because they've never undergone the experiences that teach men how relative their judgments and thinking habits are. Their resultant lack of imagination is appalling. Because they were born and raised in a given social order and in a given system of values, they believe that any other order must be unnatural and it cannot last because it's incompatible with human nature, that even they may one day know fire, hunger, and the sword. In all probability, this is what will occur, for it is hard to believe that when one half of the world is living through terrible disasters, the other half can continue a 19th century mode of life, learning about the distress of its distant fellow men only from movies and newspapers. Well, it hasn't happened yet, though I suppose there was a glimpse of it on September the 11th, 2001. Today, it seems to me what Miloš said about Americans in the 1950s applies especially to young Americans who seem especially unable to envision a situation in which order collapsed and survival is the sole imperative. I've got time before we go to discussion to introduce just two more witnesses of unfreedom. I recently read this book because I wanted a better understanding into the experience of women in the Islamic Republic, which deals with the shocking experience of mass execution within earshot of prisoners in a crowded prison in Tehran. It's often struck me that those who read The Handmaid's Tale and imagine that what's depicted there is some nightmare future of a conservative America misunderstand that it's actually a dismal representation of life in the Islamic Republic. My last witness is Yu Hua, younger than the other authors in my talk. The passage I've chosen is from his book China in 10 Words, and it goes to the heart of the phenomenon of the leadership cult. It describes the moments in his high school when Mao Zedong's death is announced. Our leader was dead. The 21st century has a lot to learn from the 20th. And the more recently you were born, the more I think you have to learn. What I've tried to do with these 5 glimpses of unfreedom is to identify and make vivid 5 of the essential features of a free society and their opposites. The essentials are privacy and autonomy, equality before the law, basic security, freedom from fear, and accountable leaders. And the reason we know they're essentials is that as we read these 5 witnesses, we see what their opposites meant. To be under constant surveillance, the discrimination that selects certain social groups and treats them differently from others is always bad, even when it's motivated by the notion of social justice. The fact of discrimination is always inequality before the law, and it never leads anywhere good, no matter what revolutionary ideology may motivate it. Disorder, chaos, organized lethal violence is the thing that nearly always precedes the destruction of freedom. Fear is crucial to unfreedom. And fear is something profoundly harmful and traumatic to the individual. I believe, in fact, that you cannot have an unfree society without terror, without threats of violence. Finally, notice the importance of the personality cult in Yu Hua's recollections of the Cultural Revolution. Personality cults are an integral part of unfree societies. We should be on the lookout for leaders that don't take themselves too seriously. And we should always be extremely wary of humorless leaders. And I hope that in this talk, I've made it clear why it's so important to think of freedom and unfreedom as 2 sides of a coin of human experience. Surely only by understanding its opposite can we teach young people in the United States, in Brazil, and around the world the absolute sanctity of liberty.
You mentioned that the power of propaganda makes a very important, plays a very important role in autocracies. My question here is, why propaganda from autocracies like Russia are still efficient, not only in Russia, but especially in the free world?
One of the things that changed with the advent of the internet that most commentators underestimated was the emergence of a public sphere without borders. And authoritarian regimes turned out to be pretty good at exploiting that suddenly easier access to American and also to European and even also Latin American publics. And it's one of those many differences that we slightly underestimate because it's somewhat imperceptible, this change. I'm not sure there was ever a moment that anybody noticed that we globalized culture.
Do you think we are seeing an escalation of autocracies and assaults on freedom because our civil society groups have become more silent, more lenient with autocracies?
In The Square and the Tower, I made the argument that totalitarian regimes of the mid-20th century systematically stamped out associational life of all kinds. So it's very important for us to understand that a free society is not something mandated by a constitution. A free society exists independently of politics in the form of associational life. Fórum da Liberdade is part of this phenomenon in Brazil today. And it seems to me that as long as we are all engaged in that kind of activity, we have a shot at preserving a free society. It still matters. It will still promote freedom because it will signal the readiness of citizens to work together for common purposes without any reference at all to the political sphere.